expand the use of fossil fuels. Hence, every scenario out there includes large amounts of fossil fuels, even in 2050. Net zero 1.5 scenarios all include large amounts of fossil fuels. The International Energy Agency scenario includes 25% of the energy still being fossil fuels in 2050. I mean, there's no way that can be reconciled with what the science tells us, unless you rely on negative emissions. But all of this lot of virtuous organizations, all of these have net zero 2050 targets. None of those are intended to stop producing gas and oil in 2050. It's only scope 1 and 2, if you read their reports. Scope 3, burning the stuff, is not included. But presumably that's the purpose of getting it out of the ground, is to burn it, unless you're just going to store it somewhere for fun. All of these countries are looking for more oil and gas. And yet we know from the research we can't burn half the oil and gas we want. If you want for a good chance of 1.5, you can burn about a third of what we have. So net zero is, first, it's not zero fossil fuels, nothing like it. There's this whole framing that allows us to expand the carbon budget so we can all feel slightly happier in our homes today because we haven't got to make these big changes. It disguises as a sort of a greenwashed business as usual. That's what we've been doing for decades now, has been in line with our Paris and other equity commitments. And Isaac and I, with another colleague, we did a little bit of work trying to look at what would the Swedish policy, or the UK policy indeed, look like if it was carried out sort of globally, and it would look at something like 2.5 degrees centigrade of warming, if not more. So to conclude, the headline choice for developed countries more widely, not just for Sweden, is that if we want to ignore international equity, which is what we've done so far, we want to pass a huge burden of climate change onto our children, 2.5, 3 degrees centigrade future, if not higher than that, renege on our international agreements, then that does dovetail nicely, well, particularly in Sweden and the UK at the moment, dovetails very nicely with our current politics, which is do very little about climate change. It maintains the market economic model, so we can privatise lots more things. And as long as you get some sort of mitigation, about 5% per annum, at most probably, that we get out of this, and net zero by 2045, then that all fits together. And we just have to hope that our children will forgive us for deliberately scamming the whole system. But if we're serious about this, then we need international equity to be a key driver in our policies. We need a huge effort by this generation, and that's why we don't like it, by this generation. We need to cut emissions in line with 1.5 at the outside too, and that means we have to meet our Paris commitments. But that is a complete change in our structures of our society. We need a massive ramp up in government leadership here, reshaping of mainstream economics. And I would argue that's happened to some degree, but not in a positive way, since the banking crisis and then since COVID. So I think mainstream economics is in the air at the moment, but it's not coming down in any way that seems to be particularly sustainable. And we need equity at its core. But you're then talking about 15 to 25% cuts in emissions year on year for developed countries, which sounds impossible. But if we'd started earlier, it would have been much simpler to do. But the equity part, I think, gives us real scope there, because within our countries, there are huge differences in our emissions. If we are to deliver on Paris, we're going to need to reconsider, what does growth mean? What's progress? What is development? We're going to have to ask these sorts of questions about our society, and we don't have a long time to answer them anymore. But hopefully we've been thinking about it for a while. We need to reframe issues of value and how we reward success. We typically reward success like if you're a lecturer in a university, you become a professor, you get a large pay increase, which means basically you have a higher carbon footprint. So at the moment, we reward success by giving people more carbon emissions. When you have an alternative relationship with time, we pretty much ignore the past and we pretty much ignore the future. So there seems to be some sort of rapidly sort of condensing time towards just the immediate period. That's not true for everyone, but there's an element of that in our systems that we have, particularly in our economic systems. We need to think about intra and intergenerational equity. So other parts of the world are suffering the impacts today. Of course, our children will suffer the impacts. Indeed, some of us are now as well. And we have to have a much deeper appreciation. And this comes from ongoing discussions with Isaac. I wasn't sure how to phrase this years ago, but the more than human world, of which, of course, we are a small part, and by no means, I think, an essential part. This is taken from the IPCC, again, that sort of relatively conservative organization. And I don't think we could say it any better. Targeting a climate resilient, sustainable world involves fundamental changes to how society functions, including changes to our underlying values, our worldviews, ideologies, social structures, political economic systems, and power relationships. I mean, in other words, throw it all up in the air and start again. And that's from the IPCC, which I'm amazed that ever got past the lawyers. Because it's very carefully checked when these things are published. But anyway, that quote is in there from Working Group 2. And I think that captures the essence